In the last episode, when I was replacing my valve cover gasket, I noticed that the timing chain slipper, or a guide as it's more commonly known, was broken. There was a piece of the guide sitting behind the timing chain cover, and as you can see, the black plastic has separated from the metal guide. Obviously, this is a problem that has to be fixed. In order to replace the timing chain components on this motor, you have to remove the cylinder head, and to do that, you have to remove both oil pans and basically disassemble the entire motor to the short block in frame. After thinking about it for a while and knowing that I have to replace basically every gasket on this motor anyway, as everything that's plastic or rubber has turned into glass and shatters when you barely touch it, I decided that would be way too annoying and I'd probably go insane having to work around everything, especially without a lift. And that brings us to today, where I have decided to just pull the entire motor out and make my life just a little bit easier. Alright, so the first thing that I want to do before we start pulling the motor out is check the compression across all 6 cylinders. If I don't have to replace the bottom end, that will save me a lot of time, and this motor actually checked out very well at around 180 to 185 on all cylinders. We went through it twice and it was within 5 on all 6 cylinders, so it's very healthy in that regard. Another thing that I have to do before removing the engine is break the crank bolt free. This is torqued to 300 foot-pounds, and I'm not going to crank on it when it's on the engine stand. It's going to fall over and be a disaster. So what I did was I rested a breaker bar against the frame, had a friend crank the engine over for a second, broke the bolt free, and now we can get started on tearing everything down. When I say this engine leaks from absolutely everywhere, I really mean it. The second we loosened the crank bolt, it started leaking through the threads because of a bad front seal. We also found a loose power steering line without a bolt to secure it, and that was leaking too. Even the steering stabilizer was leaking. To prep this motor, we're just removing everything that's attached to it. The radiator, coolant hoses, wiring harnesses, battery, exhaust, AC lines, throttle cables, intake tube, and just so on. If it's attached to the engine, we're removing it at this point.
Alright, so it's basically the end of day one. As you can see, this entire truck is basically torn apart like it's at a junkyard. We're getting this engine ready to pull out of here. We have everything taken off, AC compressor, radiator, everything attached to it, all the wiring. We're probably going to have some more wiring we have to take off tomorrow, but one more thing I want to get done today is get the exhaust off. So we're going to have to loosen it from down there at the actual catalytic converter. So right here. Hopefully these all come off with no issues. Then we're gonna have to take it off from the actual exhaust manifold itself right there. And then tomorrow, I think that we can actually get started on taking out the bell housing or loosening the bell housing, disconnecting the torque converter, and then taking this engine out of the frame. Welcome to day 2 of the engine removal process out of this 80 series landcruiser. We weren't able to get the exhaust off last night like we had planned. All of the bolts that hold that lower Y pipe deal to the actual exhaust manifold are seized. So we coated them in PB Blaster overnight, and hopefully we'll be able to get that off today. Another thing that we need to do is start going through and labeling everything. You can see we have some things labeled right here, but everything else needs to be labeled too on the wiring harness and whatnot. There's one more fuel line under there, and then I have to go disconnect all the bell housing bolts, and we should be able to lift this out, separating the engine from the transmission. Now that's not the way that the FSM says to do it. They want you to take out the entire unit as one huge piece. Now this is a really big motor. This is a 4.5 liter inline 6. It's about 600 pounds, and it just seems a little sketchy to me to pull the whole thing out. Plus I don't want to take out the transmission. So I think if we take off this front section here, since you see these 2 bolts, this front part of the support actually comes out of the radiator support, and you have this big open area to pull things straight out of the frame. So I think we'll be able to pull the motor out without the transmission.
In order to remove the front support section, we had to take off the transmission cooler, hood latch, wiring harness, and remove the AC lines from the condenser. After that, the center support came off, and we were able to remove the condenser too. This left us with a big gaping hole that should make removing the engine easier, almost like Toyota knew how huge this thing was and tried to make it more convenient for people.
So we were finally able to get the exhaust off. We had to soak it in PB Blaster overnight, and then we had to use a special tool to get this thing off. As you can see, it's completely mangled. The metal got really soft, just lots of heat cycling, and it was really hard to get that thing out of there. My buddy Ryan has these cool sockets that kind of bite into it, and it wasn't able to fully go over the stud, but what we did was we just hammered it on and then just barely put the extension into the end of it. And I knew it finally came free, because for the other 3 ones, it felt like my entire body exploded under there when the piece finally came off, and it was the same feeling for this one when it came off finally. And as you can see, there way up there, not really easy to get to, and really stuck. We had to use this entire jack handle as a breaker bar on this 1/2-inch ratchet, but yeah, got it out. And now we can move on to taking off the catalytic converter right here, get this pipe out of the way, and then disconnect the bell housing from the motor and lift this thing out.
So here we are at the end of day 2, and I'm under the landcruiser removing the starter, torque converter bolts, and trying to get to all of the bell housing bolts. There are 2 on top that you have to do some sorcery to remove. Either lower the motor, get 12 feet of extensions and try to get them from the back of the truck, or cut holes in your firewall to reach them. We'll be lowering the motor. I'll tell you, it's really obvious that Toyota wants you to remove this powertrain as a complete unit. There are wiring harnesses, cooler lines, and bolts that are very difficult to get to that wouldn't be as challenging if you just removed everything as one piece. We did not successfully remove the engine on day 2 because we ran out of daylight. We're probably 8 or so hours into this project at this point.
Alright guys, it has been exactly 1 week and I'm heading out to the hardware store to pick up some bolts to bolt that motor to the engine stand. So this is a bell housing bolt right here. I'm going to buy the exact same pitch and everything. I just need it to be longer to actually get through the stand into the motor. You might be wondering, why has it taken a week to get to this point? Well, that's because I already have a 1,000-pound engine stand. It's not enough to support the 1FZ. I bought a 1,250-pound engine stand, and I'm just receiving this thing in parts. Like, I got the box was all torn apart. It was missing 2 of the actual fingers that go to the block from the stand. It was missing 2 of the wheels. It was missing the hardware. And so now I'm just kind of playing tag with the shipping company trying to get everything for that engine stand, and it's just taking a long time. So at the moment, I think I'm just gonna bolt the motor to the 1,000-pound stand, and then once all the parts come for the 1250 stand, I'll move it over to that one. Other than that, all I have to do is take out the 2 top bell housing bolts and then just pull this motor out. So we're almost there. Okay, so I started pulling the motor out. As you can see, I actually removed the rubber mounts and I just have the engine mount themselves sitting on the frame right there to kind of lower the motor to get easier access to these bell housing bolts. They're way back there. If you are trying to do this, don't think it's just gonna be a walk in the park getting those bell housing bolts out. Let me show you where they are, if I can even show you from this angle. They are up, you can't even see it, but they're up there. Way up there, there's one right there, and one right here. So, very hard to get to. I was able to get to one with a wrench through the back of the motor right there, sitting on the engine. The other one is right there, and there's actually one more, like, right there. All extremely hard to get to. What I'm gonna try to do is stack up a bunch of extensions and get it from the back of the truck, just like I did with my 3RZ swapped first gen, and hopefully we can get this thing apart. I'm definitely gonna take the transmission out and put it all back in as one unit. It's not worth the struggle to just pull out the motor as I'm doing here. Yeah, I don't see this being a very feasible option. Now I just lost my wobble up there in the abyss. Just pull the whole thing out. Don't separate the engine like me. I am making this 10 times harder than it has to be. Be so much easier to just pull out the transmission with it. Don't try to shortcut it. Just pull everything out. Oh, broke my wobble. This is not working out.
This was the easiest way I found to get to the top bolts. I'm basically just shoving my arm behind the motor and turning a 17mm wrench at an attempt to loosen one of the top bolts. I won't lie, I heavily considered cutting access holes in my firewall and just plugging them with a rubber hole plug. I totally understand why people do this. It makes complete sense. These are so hard to get to, and it might just not be worth the struggle for most people.
Not easy at all. Very challenging to get that bolt out.
My technique here is to just slowly lift the engine, go under the cruiser, pry between the block and transmission to help separate the two, and make sure the torque converter stays exactly where it is. Then just rinse and repeat until the two are separated. They actually came apart really easily, and then my focus was to slowly remove the engine, using deliberate movements, making sure not to tip this thing over and that it's stable.
Engine's free, I just gotta get it out. That's it. Looking like we're clear.
Once again, I am moving slowly and making sure not to make any sudden movements that would cause the weight to shift in a direction that I don't want it to. Slow and steady.
Yep, that's all leaking. Got a huge oil leak in the rear main right here. Alright, so as you guys can see, the motor is out and it's completely dark outside, so I'm just using a little flashlight and my headlights to show you guys what's going on here. I got the motor out of the truck and I put it on my 1,000-pound engine stand. As I said earlier, I really don't recommend using these for big inline sixes like this thing. As you can see right here, I am using some blocks of wood to just support the front of it because it's very tippy and the stand doesn't want to stay stable. And I also have an engine crane holding it as well. But I mean, as I said earlier in the video, this is not a permanent solution. I do have a heavy duty engine stand. I'm just waiting for some parts to show up. But yeah, I was able to get this thing out. It wasn't easy, I won't lie to you. This was a very annoying motor to pull. Probably the most annoying motor I've ever pulled. And I think that's partially my fault because this is supposed to come out with the transmission. So let me show you some things over here. Now I am a manual transmission guy, but if you're planning on doing this, make sure that torque converter stays back the whole time. Apparently if these things slide forward, a bunch of fluid will come out. And you also want to be really careful of this collar right here. So that collar, it looks to me as if it's fixed on the torque converter and it probably centers that thing in the crank. So if you mess that thing up when you're pulling your motor out, you're probably gonna have to get a new torque converter. These are the bolts that are really hard to get to. So this one right here, that one, and that one. Just the top two and this one over here at like 10 o'clock. Very, very hard to get to. The way that I did it was I removed the motor mounts, then lowered the motor, and I used really long extensions, a bunch of combinations of different tools, and was able to get them out. Only left with a couple of busted knuckles and hurt feelings. But yeah, I got the motor out of this thing. All right guys, that's gonna wrap it up for this video. I'm filthy, it's late, and I need to eat some dinner. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the upcoming videos with this FZJ80 Land Cruiser. Later.